3,200 miles. That is how far a single train carried Canadian wheat in September 2025. From Manitoba, all the way to Mexico City. Not through Canadian ports, not through U.S. export terminals. Straight through the heart of the United States. On Canadian Pacific Kansas City rails. That one train sent a clear message. The old grain routes are breaking, and U.S. exporters are no longer required. For decades, Canadian grain moved south into the United States. It passed through American ports, American terminals, American hands. Those routes made U.S. exporters powerful middlemen. Now they are being cut out. In Mexico City, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood beside CPKC CEO Keith Creel. They were not celebrating a test run. They were announcing a new reality. Canadian grain can now reach global buyers without U.S. permission. This is not about one shipment. It is about control. Canada is quietly rerouting grain away from U.S. ports, toward Mexico, toward Asia, toward direct, stable partners. And American exporters are watching billions in business move past them, one train at a time. But this did not happen by accident. To understand what is happening, you need to understand one railroad. Canadian Pacific Kansas City. CPKC was created in 2023 when Canadian Pacific bought Kansas City Southern. For the first time, one rail line connected Canada, the United States, and Mexico. One line. No transfers, no ports, no bottlenecks. That Manitoba to Mexico City train was proof that the system works. CPKC now moves Canadian wheat, oats, canola oil, and specialty crops directly to Mexico. Not once. Not sometimes. On a regular basis. This is not a backup plan. It is a new trade flow. CPKC CEO Keith Creel said it clearly. The rail network gives shippers more routes and more market access during trade uncertainty. That phrase matters. Trade uncertainty means tariffs. It means border delays. It means sudden rule changes. It means Donald Trump. Canadian shippers learned a hard lesson. Relying on U.S. export infrastructure is risky, so they stopped relying on it. Here's the part most Americans miss. Most of that 3,200-mile route runs through the United States. American rail lines. American crews. American states. U.S. workers are moving Canadian grain straight past U.S. ports and into Mexico. The jobs stay. The export fees disappear. Grain that once paid U.S. port operators now skips them entirely. And this shift is just getting started. Here is the irony. Most of this grain still moves through the United States. The trains cross American states. They stop on American rail lines. They switch crews inside the U.S. There are around 11 crew changes inside American territory on the route to Mexico City. U.S. workers are doing the work, but the money is no longer staying. Before, this grain stopped at U.S. ports. Houston, New Orleans, Seattle, Tacoma. Those ports charged fees. Terminals made money. Handlers made money. Shipping companies made money. Now the trains do not stop. They pass straight through. According to Transport Canada, over 94% of Canadian grain exports move by rail. Rail controls everything, and control is shifting. In 2023, Canadian National Rail moved over 21 million metric tons of grain to Western Canadian ports. Less than 2 million went toward the United States. CPKC moved more than 5 million metric tons to the U.S., but that number is changing fast. What the numbers do not show is the direction. More grain is going east to Canadian ports. More grain is going south, straight into Mexico. Less grain is stopping in the United States. And once those volumes leave, they do not come back easily. Mexico used to be a side market. Not anymore. Mexico's demand for grain is rising fast. Livestock is growing. Poultry is growing. Food processing is expanding. Mexico needs wheat. It needs oats. It needs specialty crops. And Mexico offers something U.S. buyers no longer do. Stability. When Canadian grain goes straight to Mexico City, it avoids U.S. ports. It avoids U.S. inspections. It avoids U.S. delays. It becomes direct Canada-Mexico trade. For Canadian farmers, this changes everything. They reduce dependence on the United States. They reduce exposure to tariffs. They avoid sudden policy shifts. For Mexico, it means reliable supply without U.S. interference. And for CPKC, every mile of that 3,200-mile route earns revenue. That creates a powerful incentive. CPKC is not neutral. It benefits from selling Canadian grain directly to Mexican buyers. This is no longer about politics. It is about math. And the math no longer favors U.S. ports. Now let's track where the grain used to go. For years, Canadian grain flowed into U.S. ports in the Pacific Northwest. Seattle, Tacoma, Portland. From there, it went to Asia, Japan, South Korea, China, Indonesia. Those ports handled massive volumes. That is changing. Canada expanded its own West Coast capacity. The Port of Vancouver now moves around 20 million metric tons of grain. Prince Rupert is expanding to handle even more. Canadian grain can now reach Asian buyers without touching U.S. soil. Every shipment that leaves through Vancouver instead of Seattle is lost revenue for the United States. The same thing is happening on the Gulf Coast. Houston and New Orleans used to handle Canadian grain moving south. Now that grain goes straight to Mexico by rail, or it moves east to Canadian ports. The Gulf Coast loses the volume. Even the Great Lakes are feeling it. Thunder Bay feeds grain into eastern Canada. Montreal and Quebec are taking more of that business. Routes that once depended on U.S. cooperation are being avoided on purpose. This is not a short-term shift. It is a redesign. Here's the part most people overlook. When Canadian grain moved through U.S. ports, it helped American exporters. Volumes were larger. Shipping costs were lower. Blending was easier. U.S. wheat and Canadian wheat moved together. That made American exporters more competitive. Now that advantage is gone. U.S. exporters handle smaller volumes. Shipping costs rise. Margins shrink. At the same time, Canadian grain becomes more competitive. Better routes. Fewer fees. Faster delivery. Canadian grain reaches buyers with lower costs and fewer delays. That forces U.S. exporters to cut prices or lose contracts. This is not just about ports losing business. It is about the United States losing leverage in global grain markets. And the damage does not stop once it starts. This shift did not happen overnight. Canada planned it. CPKC invested over 500 million Canadian dollars in new hopper cars. It added 100 new locomotives in 2025. These trains are built to move grain long distances, across 3 countries, without stopping. Canadian National Rail did the same. Its grain plan targets up to 29 million metric tons a year, with enough cars, crews, and rail capacity already in place. These are not small upgrades. They are permanent investments. Canada also removed paperwork delays. In late 2025, it launched electronic export certificates for grain shipments to Mexico. No mailing delays, no lost documents, faster clearance, cleaner trade. Everything points in one direction. Canada is building systems that do not need the United States. Once those systems are in place, there is no reason to go back. Some people think this ends when politics change. It will not. Trade routes do not reset with elections. Once buyers sign multi-year contracts, they stick. Once rail lines are optimized, they stay optimized. Once ports expand, they do not shrink. A Mexican feed buyer who receives steady grain from Canada will not switch back. Not for convenience. Not for politics. Asian buyers using Vancouver will not return to Seattle. European buyers using Eastern Canada will not reroute through U.S. ports. The relationships are already forming. The money has already moved. The United States is not losing grain because of one decision. It is losing relevance because others built alternatives. And that is the hardest loss to undo. Donald Trump believed size meant control. He believed the U.S. market was too big to avoid, that Canada had nowhere else to go. That pressure would force compliance. It did not. Tariff threats did not pull Canada closer. They pushed Canada away. Border uncertainty did not create leverage. It created alternatives. Every time trade talks stalled, Canadian shippers looked for exits. Every time rules changed, buyers looked for safer routes. Mexico stepped in. Asia stayed open. Europe stayed reachable. Canada did not confront the United States. It engineered around it, rail by rail, port by port. Trump said tough trade would protect American workers. But American port workers are watching trains roll past without stopping. The grain is still moving. The business is not. This is the real outcome. Canada no longer needs U.S. ports to sell grain. Mexico no longer needs U.S. middlemen to buy it. Asian buyers no longer depend on U.S. terminals. The United States is still there, just no longer essential. That is the most dangerous position of all. Once partners learn they can operate without you, they stop planning around you. The grain trains keep moving. The contracts keep signing. The routes keep shifting. And none of it requires American approval. This is not a temporary setback. It is permanent damage. Canadian grain now moves to Mexico by rail, to Asia through Canadian ports, to Europe through eastern Canada. U.S. ports lose volume. Terminal operators lose revenue. Support businesses shrink. Once these routes exist, they do not disappear. Infrastructure stays. Contracts stay. Trust stays. Even if leadership changes in Washington, the system does not reset. Trade flows follow stability, not promises. Canada learned that lesson. Mexico learned it too. The United States is learning it late. That 3,200-mile train was not just about wheat. It was a warning. When you treat partners like subordinates, they build exits. When you create chaos, others design order. When you weaponize trade, you lose trust. Canadian grain is still selling. Buyers are still buying. The trains are still moving. They just do not need the United States anymore. Donald Trump can say he is winning. But American port workers see the truth. The grain rolls past. The money goes elsewhere. What do you think about this shift in North American trade? Leave a comment below.